Picture this: a man who built his empire on golden towers and reality television stand in the shadow of a thousand-year-old castle, about to dine with a king whose family has ruled for centuries. The American president who tweets at dawn is preparing to navigate the most formal dinner protocol on Earth, where every fork has a purpose and every word carries weight. This is not just a meeting between two leaders. This is a collision of two worlds, two philosophies, two completely different ways of understanding power. When Donald Trump received the invitation to a state banquet at Windsor Castle with King Charles III, nobody could have predicted what would unfold. The golden ballroom that has hosted emperors and queens was about to witness something unprecedented. A dinner that would reveal not just the art of diplomacy, but the very human drama that unfolds when protocol meets personality, when tradition faces disruption, and when two very different men must find common ground over crystal glasses and centuries-old silver. What happened behind those ancient walls would change how the world viewed both leaders forever. This is that story. The morning sun cast long shadows across the south lawn of the White House as President Donald Trump concluded his daily security briefing. It was a Tuesday in March 2024, and the world seemed to be spinning faster than usual. Trade wars, diplomatic tensions, and the constant buzz of campaign preparations filled every corner of his schedule. But nothing could have prepared him for the call that came at precisely 11:47 a.m. Sarah Matthews, his deputy press secretary, knocked gently on the Oval Office door. Trump looked up from a stack of papers, his reading glasses perched on his nose in a way that always made him feel older than he cared to admit. The presidency had aged him, though he would never acknowledge it publicly. The constant weight of decisions, the relentless media scrutiny, and the isolation that came with the highest office in the land had left their mark. "Mr. President, we have an urgent communication from Buckingham Palace," Sarah announced, her voice carrying an unusual note of excitement. She held an ornate envelope in her hands, the kind of stationery that spoke of centuries-old traditions and uncompromising formality. Trump removed his glasses and gestured for her to approach. The envelope was heavy, made of cream-colored paper that felt substantial between his fingers. The royal seal was embossed in gold, catching the light from the windows that overlooked the rose garden. For a moment, he simply held it, understanding that whatever lay inside would demand his attention in a way that few things could. The letter inside was written in elegant script on official Windsor Castle letterhead. King Charles III, in his measured and careful handwriting, extended a personal invitation for a state banquet at Windsor Castle. The date proposed was just 6 weeks away, and the tone of the invitation suggested this was more than mere diplomatic courtesy. The king wrote of the importance of strengthening ties between their nations and expressed his personal desire to host the American president at what he called our most treasured residence. Trump read the letter twice, then a third time. State banquets at Windsor Castle were rare events, reserved for the most significant diplomatic occasions. The castle itself was not just a residence, but a symbol of British history, a place where kings and queens had ruled for nearly a millennium. To be invited, there was to be welcomed into the very heart of the British monarchy. But this invitation came at a complex time. Trump's relationship with the British establishment had been rocky throughout his presidency. His unconventional style had clashed with traditional diplomatic protocols on multiple occasions. British politicians had criticized his policies, and the British press had been particularly harsh in their coverage of his administration. Yet here was the king himself, extending what appeared to be a genuine olive branch. The more Trump considered it, the more intriguing the proposition became. Windsor Castle represented everything he both admired and found frustrating about European aristocracy. The history, the grandeur, the unshakable traditions, these were things he respected. But the rigid protocols, the unwritten rules, and the subtle ways of communicating that seemed to govern royal interactions were foreign to his direct, business-minded approach. He called in his chief of staff, Mark Meadows, and his Secretary of State. Within an hour, the Oval Office was filled with advisors discussing the implications of the invitation. Some saw it as a tremendous opportunity to reset relationships with America's closest ally. Others worried about the potential for diplomatic missteps in such a formal setting. Windsor Castle isn't just any venue, explained the protocol officer who had been hastily summoned from the State Department. It's where Queen Elizabeth hosted her most important guests. The banquets there follow traditions that go back centuries. Every detail matters, from the order of precedence to the specific wines served with each course. Trump listened to the briefing with growing fascination. He had always been drawn to grand gestures and impressive settings. His own properties were designed to impress, to demonstrate success and power through sheer visual impact. But Windsor Castle operated on a different principle entirely. Its power came not from ostentation, but from history, from the accumulated weight of centuries of royal residence. The decision, when it came, surprised no one who truly knew Trump. He would accept the invitation, but on his own terms. He wanted to understand not just the formal requirements, but the real story behind them. Who had dined in those halls before him? What conversations had shaped the course of history within those ancient walls? How did one navigate the complex social dynamics of a royal banquet while still remaining authentically American? His staff began the enormous task of preparation. The Secret Service would need to coordinate with British security services. The State Department would work with the Foreign Office on protocol details. His personal staff would need to understand the intricate rules governing everything from dress codes to conversation topics. But Trump himself was thinking beyond the logistics. He recognized this invitation as something unprecedented in his presidency, a chance to engage with a different kind of power, one that was older and more subtle than anything he had encountered in his business career or political life. King Charles was known for his thoughtful approach to environmental issues, his deep interest in architecture and urban planning, and his philosophical bent towards sustainable living. These were topics that could lead to substantive conversations, assuming they could find common ground. As the weeks of preparation began, Trump found himself genuinely curious about his host. Charles had waited decades to become king, taking the throne only after the death of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II. He had used those years to develop his own vision of what modern monarchy could be, focusing on issues that mattered to him personally while maintaining the institutional dignity that the crown required. The American president began reading about Windsor Castle's history during his morning briefings. He learned about the Norman foundations, the medieval additions, and the Victorian renovations that had shaped the castle into its current form. He discovered that it was the oldest occupied castle in the world, a place where William the Conqueror had established a foothold that would grow into the British Empire. More intriguingly, he learned about the private apartments where the royal family actually lived, spaces that were hidden from public view, but represented the human side of this ancient institution. The king would be welcoming him not just as a head of state, but as a guest in what was essentially his family home, albeit one with 1,000 rooms and 800 years of ghost stories. The media speculation began almost immediately after the invitation was announced. British newspapers wondered whether Trump would follow protocol or attempt to impose his own style on the proceedings. American commentators debated whether this represented a diplomatic coup or a potential minefield. Social media buzzed with predictions about everything from what the First Lady would wear to whether Trump would commit some unforgivable breach of etiquette. But in the quiet moments between meetings and phone calls, Trump found himself thinking about the human element of what was to come. Stripped of all the ceremony and protocol, this would be one man hosting another for dinner. Two leaders who had inherited vastly different kinds of responsibility, sitting across from each other and attempting to find understanding despite their different backgrounds, different worldviews, and different approaches to leadership. The invitation had changed something not just in diplomatic terms, but in how Trump thought about leadership itself. For all his success in business and politics, he was about to enter a realm where success was measured not in quarterly profits or election victories, but in centuries of sustained influence. It was a humbling realization, and one that would shape his approach to the evening that lay ahead. As the date approached, one thing became clear. This would be more than just a state dinner. It would be a test of whether two very different kinds of leaders could find common ground in an ancient castle that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the signing of treaties that shaped the modern world, and the quiet conversations that had guided the course of history for nearly 1,000 years. The preparation for Windsor Castle began in earnest 3 weeks before the scheduled banquet. Trump's team had transformed a conference room in the West Wing into what they privately called Protocol Central, a space dedicated entirely to mastering the intricate dance of royal etiquette. Maps of Windsor Castle covered the walls, showing everything from the approach route to the detailed layout of St. George's Hall, where the banquet would take place. Mrs. Henderson, a protocol expert borrowed from the British Embassy, had become a fixture in the White House during these weeks. A woman in her 60s with silver hair, pulled back in a perfect chignon, she possessed the kind of quiet authority that comes from decades of managing diplomatic events without a single mistake. Her briefings with Trump were unlike any presidential preparation session his staff had ever witnessed. "Your Majesty," she began during their first formal session, "when you meet His Majesty King Charles, the greeting will set the tone for everything that follows. Americans are not required to bow, but a respectful nod is expected. The handshake should be firm but not prolonged. And please remember, he speaks first." Trump listened with an intensity that surprised his staff. Usually impatient with detailed briefings, he found himself fascinated by the layers of meaning embedded in every gesture. The idea that a nod could communicate respect while maintaining American dignity appealed to his sense of balance between power and courtesy. The dinner itself would be an orchestrated masterpiece of timing and tradition. 150 guests would be seated in St. George's Hall, a space that had hosted everyone from Napoleon III to Nelson Mandela. The guest list was a carefully curated mixture of British aristocracy, American dignitaries, business leaders, and cultural figures from both nations. Each name had been chosen not just for their status, but for their ability to facilitate meaningful conversations across the cultural divide. The seating arrangement follows strict rules of precedence, Mrs. Henderson explained, showing Trump a diagram that looked like a military battle plan. "You'll be seated to the right of His Majesty, with the First Lady across the table next to the Queen Consort. Every other position has been calculated according to rank, relationship to the crown, and diplomatic importance." Trump studied the seating chart with the same intensity he had once brought to negotiating real estate deals. He recognized some of the names: British politicians he had clashed with in the press, American ambassadors who had worked to smooth over past diplomatic rough patches, and business leaders who moved easily between both worlds. The arrangement was clearly designed to create opportunities for reconciliation and relationship building. The menu planning had required weeks of coordination between the royal kitchens and the White House dietary staff. King Charles, known for his commitment to organic farming and sustainable food sources, had personally selected wines from the royal cellars, some dating back decades. The meal would feature British classics prepared with ingredients from the royal estates, paired with American touches that honored Trump's preferences without compromising the essential British character of the event. "Each course tells a story," explained the royal chef during a video conference with the White House kitchen staff. "The soup course features vegetables from His Majesty's gardens at Highgrove. The fish course celebrates our shared Atlantic heritage. The meat course honors both British traditions and American expectations. Even the dessert has historical significance. It's based on a recipe served at Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. But the most complex preparations involve the entertainment and conversation. After dinner, guests would retire to different chambers of the castle for informal discussions. The king had specifically requested time for a private conversation with Trump, away from advisors and protocol officers. This presented both an opportunity and a challenge. What would two such different leaders find to discuss when stripped of their official roles? Intelligence briefings provided insights into the king's personal interests: architecture, environmental conservation, interfaith dialogue, and urban planning. These were topics that could potentially bridge the gap between Trump's business background and Charles's philosophical approach to leadership. The environmental angle, in particular, presented interesting possibilities given Trump's experience with large-scale development projects and Charles's lifelong advocacy for sustainable practices. The First Lady's preparations ran parallel to her husband's, but focused on different challenges. Melania Trump would be expected to engage with Queen Consort Camilla and other royal women in conversations that could range from charitable work to cultural exchange. Her wardrobe choices have been planned with military precision, with each outfit conveying specific messages about American elegance and respect for British traditions. Security preparations were perhaps the most complex element of the entire operation. The Secret Service had worked for weeks with British security services to create protection protocols that would be nearly invisible during the event itself. Windsor Castle's ancient walls would be equipped with state-of-the-art surveillance systems, while plainclothes agents would be positioned among the staff and guests. The challenge was maintaining the intimate atmosphere that King Charles desired while ensuring absolute safety for all participants. Every staff member would be vetted, every delivery truck would be searched, and every guest would pass through multiple security checkpoints disguised as normal protocol procedures. Trump's personal preparation went beyond memorizing protocols and conversation topics. He found himself genuinely curious about the psychology of monarchy in a modern world. How did someone prepare for a role they had known their entire life they would eventually inherit? What was it like to represent not just a government, but a 1,000-year-old institution? His staff arranged for him to speak with historians and former ambassadors who could provide insights into the royal mindset. These conversations revealed a complex picture of modern monarchy as an institution trying to maintain relevance while honoring ancient traditions. King Charles, they learned, had spent decades thinking about how to modernize the crown without losing its essential character. The king sees himself as a steward, explained one former ambassador during a briefing. He inherited something precious and intends to pass it on in better condition than he received it. That's a very different mindset from the business world, where success is often measured by how much you can extract or transform. This perspective intrigued Trump. The idea of stewardship rather than ownership resonated with his own thoughts about presidential legacy. While he had built his career on transforming properties and companies, the presidency required a different approach, one that recognized the temporary nature of political power and the importance of institutional continuity. The rehearsals began in the final week before departure. Using the state dining room as a stand-in for St. George's Hall, the White House staff walked through every element of the evening. Secret Service agents played the roles of royal guests, while protocol officers corrected posture, timing, and conversation flow. These practice sessions revealed small but important details. The proper way to hold a wine glass during toasts, the timing of standing and sitting during formal speeches, the appropriate topics for conversation during different courses, even the correct way to use the finger bowls that would appear before the dessert course. Trump approached these rehearsals with unexpected patience. He understood that this was not about changing who he was, but about showing respect for traditions that predated his country by centuries. The challenge was to remain authentically American while demonstrating appreciation for British customs. The final briefing took place in the Oval Office on the morning of departure. Maps, protocol guides, and background files covered every available surface. Trump reviewed the key points one last time: the greeting sequence, the conversation topics to avoid and embrace, the timing of gifts exchange, and the delicate balance between formality and warmth that would characterize the entire evening. But perhaps the most important preparation was psychological. This was not a business negotiation or a political rally. Success would be measured not in concrete achievements, but in the quality of human connection established between two very different leaders. The goal was not to win, but to understand, not to dominate, but to engage respectfully with a worldview that operated according to different principles. As Air Force One prepared for departure, Trump reflected on how much his perspective had changed during the weeks of preparation. The invitation had seemed like a simple diplomatic courtesy, but the preparation had revealed it as something much more complex and potentially more meaningful. He was about to enter a world where power operated according to rules that were centuries old, where influence was measured not in quarterly reports but in institutional longevity. The flight to London would give him final hours to prepare mentally for an encounter that would test not just his diplomatic skills, but his ability to adapt to a completely different understanding of leadership, tradition, and the relationship between past and present. The motorcade wound through the English countryside on a crisp Thursday morning, passing rolling green hills that seemed unchanged since Shakespeare's time. From the armored presidential limousine, Trump watched ancient oak trees and stone walls slide past the bulletproof windows. The contrast with his usual surroundings was striking. No skyscrapers, no bustling urban energy, just the timeless pastoral beauty that had inspired British poets for centuries. As they approached Windsor, the castle gradually emerged from the landscape like something from a fairy tale. The round tower, built by Henry II in the 12th century, dominated the skyline with an authority that came not from height, but from age and historical weight. Trump had seen photographs, of course, but the reality was more imposing than any image could capture. This was not just a building, but a symbol of continuity that had survived wars, revolutions, and the rise and fall of empires. The first glimpse of the castle walls brought a moment of unusual quiet to the presidential limousine. Even the Secret Service agents, professionals trained to focus on security rather than scenery, seemed affected by the sight of the ancient fortress that had guarded the Thames for nearly 1,000 years. "Mr. President," his chief of staff said softly, "we're approaching the Henry VIII Gate." The name carried weight that Trump appreciated. Henry VIII, the king who had transformed England's relationship with Europe, who had broken with Rome to assert English independence, who had rebuilt Windsor Castle according to his own vision. There was something appropriate about an American president entering through gates named for a monarch who had refused to be bound by continental conventions. The motorcade passed through the gate and into the upper ward, where British soldiers in their distinctive red uniforms lined the route. Their precision was remarkable. Every button polished, every movement synchronized, every face a mask of professional dignity. This was ceremony as high art, tradition performed with a skill that came from centuries of practice. King Charles III waited in the quadrangle, surrounded by household officials whose titles dated back to medieval times. The Lord Chamberlain, the Master of the Horse, the Crown Equerry. These were not just ceremonial positions, but working roles in an institution that had adapted ancient practices to modern requirements. The king himself cut an impressive figure in his perfectly tailored morning coat. At 75, Charles carried himself with the upright bearing of a man who had spent decades preparing for this role. His greeting was warm but measured, extending his hand with a smile that seemed genuine rather than merely diplomatic. "Mr. President, welcome to Windsor Castle," the king said, his voice carrying the accent of inherited privilege, but also a sincerity that Trump had not entirely expected. "It is my great pleasure to receive you here." The handshake was firm and brief, exactly as Mrs. Henderson had predicted. Trump had prepared for this moment carefully, but the actual encounter felt more natural than the rehearsals had suggested. Charles had a quality that put people at ease even in the most formal circumstances, a skill that Trump recognized as essential for someone whose entire life was spent in public view. The First Lady's arrival created its own moment of diplomatic theater. Melania emerged from her car wearing a navy dress that struck exactly the right balance between American sophistication and respect for British formality. Queen Consort Camilla, resplendent in a powder blue ensemble, greeted her with what appeared to be genuine warmth. The initial tour of the castle was carefully planned to showcase both its historical significance and its continued relevance as a working royal residence. They walked through the state apartments, where portraits of kings and queens gazed down from gilded frames. Each room told a story of power exercised across centuries, of decisions made in these very chambers that had shaped the modern world. The Waterloo Chamber particularly caught Trump's attention. Filled with portraits of the leaders who had defeated Napoleon, it represented a time when Britain had stood at the center of a coalition that reshaped Europe. The parallels to modern international alliances were not lost on either leader, though neither mentioned them directly. These rooms have witnessed some of history's most important conversations. King Charles observed as they paused before a portrait of the Duke of Wellington. The challenge has always been balancing the weight of tradition with the necessity of adapting to changing times. Trump nodded, understanding that this was more than historical commentary. The king was speaking about his own situation, how to honor the past while remaining relevant to the present. It was a challenge that resonated with Trump's own experience of taking over established institutions and reshaping them for new circumstances. The private study where they paused for tea offered a more intimate glimpse into the king's personal interests. Books on architecture and environmental science filled the shelves, while watercolor paintings, some clearly the king's own work, decorated the walls. This was where Charles the monarch became Charles the individual, a man with artistic interests and intellectual curiosity. Their conversation over tea revealed unexpected common ground. The king's passion for historic preservation aligned with Trump's experience in real estate development, creating opportunities for discussion about balancing economic growth with cultural heritage. When Charles mentioned his work with inner-city regeneration projects, Trump shared insights from his own urban development experience. The challenge, the king said, pouring tea from a pot that had belonged to Queen Victoria, is creating development that enhances rather than destroys the character of existing communities. Trump found himself genuinely engaged by this perspective. His business background had taught him to think about maximizing value, but the king was discussing value in terms that went beyond immediate financial return. The idea of long-term stewardship, of building things that would benefit future generations, offered a different framework for thinking about success. The afternoon included a private walk through the castle gardens, where Charles could display another of his passions. The gardens at Windsor represented decades of careful cultivation, with plants chosen not just for beauty, but for their environmental benefits. The king's knowledge was encyclopedic. He could discuss the history of specific trees, the ecological benefits of native plants, and the way traditional gardening practices could support biodiversity. For Trump, accustomed to manicured golf courses and formal landscaping, this represented a different aesthetic philosophy. The gardens were beautiful, but in a way that worked with natural systems rather than imposing human will upon them. It was landscaping as conversation with nature rather than conquest of it. Each garden tells a story. Charles explained as they walked past beds of organic herbs and vegetables. These plants have been grown here for centuries, selected by gardeners who understood that beauty and utility need not be separate goals. The personal touches throughout the castle created an atmosphere that surprised Trump. Despite its enormous size and historical significance, Windsor felt lived in rather than museum-like. Family photographs sat on side tables. Contemporary books lay open on reading chairs, and the small details of daily life were visible even in the grandest rooms. This humanization of an ancient institution impressed Trump more than the pomp and ceremony. The ability to maintain personal warmth within such a formal structure required skills that he recognized as essential for any kind of leadership. Charles had found ways to remain authentically himself while fulfilling a role that could easily overwhelm individual personality. The afternoon conversations revealed a leader who thought in terms of decades rather than election cycles. The king spoke about projects that might take 20 years to complete, about changes that would benefit grandchildren not yet born, about stewardship responsibilities that extended far beyond his own lifetime. This long-term perspective offered a different way of thinking about leadership success. As evening approached and the time for the formal banquet drew near, Trump realized that his understanding of his host had evolved considerably. The king was not the distant figurehead that media portrayals sometimes suggested, but a thoughtful leader grappling with the challenge of modernizing ancient institutions without losing their essential character. The pre-dinner reception would bring together all the evening's guests, creating opportunities for the broader diplomatic conversations that would complement the personal connection established between the two leaders. But the foundation had been laid for an evening that would be more than ceremonial courtesy. Standing in his assigned quarters as his valet prepared his formal wear, Trump reflected on the day's conversations. The castle had revealed itself as more than a magnificent setting. It was a working laboratory for the kind of leadership that thought beyond immediate goals to consider lasting impact. The evening's banquet would test whether the personal understanding developed during the afternoon could translate into meaningful diplomatic progress. Outside his windows, the ancient walls of Windsor Castle caught the last light of day, preparing for an evening that would bring together two very different approaches to power and responsibility in one of history's most storied settings. St. George's Hall had been transformed into a glittering stage for diplomatic theater. The massive medieval space, with its soaring timber roof and ancient stone walls, sparkled with the light of hundreds of candles reflected in crystal glasses and golden serving pieces. The long horseshoe table, set for 150 guests, represented the pinnacle of British entertaining. Every piece of china, every piece of silver, every linen napkin placed with precision that spoke of centuries of practice. Trump entered the hall in full evening dress, the white tie, and tails that protocol demanded, making him look more formal than his usual business attire ever could. The transformation was remarkable. The American president, who was known for his unconventional style, had adapted seamlessly to the most traditional of British customs. Beside him, the First Lady wore a midnight blue gown that caught the candlelight with subtle elegance. The guests were already assembled, having gathered in the Waterloo Chamber for pre-dinner champagne. The mix was carefully curated to represent the best of both nations. British cabinet ministers chatted with American senators. Business leaders from both sides of the Atlantic discovered common interests, and cultural figures found themselves comparing notes on everything from architecture to literature. King Charles led the procession into St. George's Hall with the kind of natural authority that comes from a lifetime of formal occasions. He had changed into his own evening wear, complete with the ceremonial decorations that marked his position as sovereign. The Star of the Order of the Garter glittered on his chest, a reminder of traditions that connected this evening to centuries of British history. The seating arrangement had been planned with diplomatic precision. Trump found himself positioned at the king's right hand, the place of honor that acknowledged his status as the evening's principal guest. To his right sat the Archbishop of Canterbury, a placement that would allow for fascinating conversations about the role of faith in public life. Across the table, the First Lady was seated between the Queen Consort and the British Foreign Secretary, positioning her for discussions that could range from cultural exchange to international relations. The first course arrived with ceremony that bordered on ballet. Footmen in scarlet livery served the soup, a delicate consommé made from organic vegetables grown in the king's own gardens at Highgrove. The presentation was flawless, each bowl placed with silent precision while the Royal String Quartet played softly from the musicians' gallery above. Conversation began tentatively, as formal dinners always do, with polite inquiries about the weather and compliments on the magnificent setting. But as the wine began to flow, a crisp Sancerre from the royal cellars, the discussions deepened. Trump found himself engaged in an unexpected conversation with the Archbishop about the role of moral leadership in challenging times. The difficulty, the Archbishop observed, is maintaining hope while acknowledging the very real problems that face our world. Leadership requires both honesty about challenges and confidence in our ability to address them. Trump, who had built his political career on promises to solve seemingly intractable problems, found this perspective intriguing. The Archbishop's approach was more philosophical than political, focused on inspiring people to be their best selves rather than simply offering policy solutions. It was a different way of thinking about influence and responsibility, The second course, fresh salmon from Scottish waters, prepared simply to highlight its natural flavor, prompted conversations about environmental stewardship. The king's passion for sustainable fishing practices led to a broader discussion about balancing economic needs with conservation requirements. Trump, drawing on his experience with coastal properties, found himself genuinely interested in the technical challenges of marine conservation. The fishing communities along our coasts have practiced sustainable harvesting for generations, Charles explained. The challenge is scaling those traditional practices to meet modern demand while protecting the ecosystems that make the fishing possible in the first place. This resonated with Trump's understanding of long-term business planning. The idea of maintaining resources to ensure future productivity aligned with his experience in property development, where short-term profits had to be balanced against long-term value creation. The conversation revealed unexpected common ground between the businessman president and the environmentally conscious monarch. As the main course arrived, perfectly roasted beef from the royal farms at Sandringham, accompanied by vegetables that showcased British seasonal cooking at its finest, the conversations became more personal and less formal. The wine, a magnificent Bordeaux from 1982, seemed to encourage more open sharing of perspectives and experiences. Trump found himself describing his transition from business to politics, the challenges of adapting entrepreneurial instincts to the constraints of government, and the difficulty of maintaining long-term vision while addressing immediate crises. The king, in turn, shared insights about his own transition from heir apparent to sovereign, the weight of inherited responsibility, and the challenge of modernizing ancient institutions without losing their essential character. The crown is not something one possesses, Charles said thoughtfully, but something one serves. The challenge is being worthy of that service while remaining true to one's own values and vision. This concept of service-based leadership struck Trump as both foreign and compelling. His business career had been built on acquisition and control, on taking ownership and imposing his vision. But the presidency, he was beginning to understand, required a different approach, one that recognized the temporary nature of political power and the importance of institutional continuity. The conversation was interrupted by the traditional toasts that marked the formal centerpiece of the evening. The king rose, glass in hand, and the entire hall fell silent. His speech was brief but eloquent, speaking of the friendship between Britain and America, the challenges facing democratic nations, and the importance of maintaining dialogue even when perspectives differed. Our two nations, he said, have not always agreed on every issue, but we have always found ways to discuss our differences with respect and to work together when our fundamental values are at stake. Tonight celebrates not just the ties between our governments, but the deeper connections between our peoples. Trump's response was equally measured, speaking about the shared heritage that connected Britain and America, the innovations that had emerged from their partnership, and the mutual respect that made honest dialogue possible even in an era of global uncertainty. Your Majesty has created an evening that honors both tradition and progress, Trump said, raising his glass. This castle has seen centuries of history, and tonight it witnesses the continuation of a friendship that has helped shape the modern world. The toasts were followed by the dessert course, a contemporary interpretation of a Victorian pudding that managed to be both traditional and innovative. The conversation grew more animated as the formal constraints of the early courses gave way to the relaxed atmosphere that good food and wine invariably create. Trump found himself engaged in multiple conversations simultaneously, discussing urban development with a British architect to his left while listening to the king describe his organic farming experiments. The evening had become less about diplomatic protocol and more about human connection, less about representing positions, and more about sharing experiences. The Queen Consort, from across the table, shared stories of her charitable work with literacy programs, drawing comparisons with American education initiatives that the First Lady had championed. These conversations revealed the human dimension of public service, the ways that formal roles could be used to address real problems in people's daily lives. As the evening progressed, Trump realized that his initial expectations had been both met and exceeded. The formal elements of the banquet had been magnificent. The setting, the food, the ceremony had all lived up to the reputation of royal entertaining. But the human connections that had developed were more valuable than he had anticipated. The king had proven to be not just a gracious host, but a thoughtful conversationalist whose perspectives challenged and enriched Trump's own thinking about leadership, responsibility, and the relationship between tradition and innovation. The other guests had contributed to discussions that ranged far beyond conventional diplomatic topics, exploring ideas about culture, technology, spirituality, and the future of democratic society. As the formal dinner portion of the evening concluded and guests began to move toward other chambers for coffee and continued conversation, Trump understood that something significant had occurred. This had not been merely a ceremonial occasion, but a genuine meeting of minds, a chance for leaders from different traditions to find common ground and mutual respect. The evening was far from over, but already it had exceeded expectations. The ancient walls of Windsor Castle had witnessed another historic gathering, one that would be remembered not just for its formal magnificence, but for the quality of human connection it had fostered between leaders grappling with the challenges of governing in a complex and rapidly changing world. After the formal dinner concluded, King Charles led Trump through a series of private corridors away from the main gathering. The other guests had moved to the green drawing room and the crimson drawing room for coffee and brandy, their conversations continuing the diplomatic and cultural exchanges that had begun during dinner. But the king had specifically requested time for a private discussion away from advisors and protocol officers. They walked through galleries lined with portraits of monarchs dating back centuries, each painting telling a story of leadership exercised under different circumstances, but always within the same institutional framework. The contrast with American presidential portraits, which represented individual achievements within a much younger system, was striking. Here was a visual reminder of continuity that transcended any single leader's tenure. The king's private study, where they finally settled, felt more like a scholar's retreat than a royal office. Books covered every available surface, many showing signs of actual reading rather than decorative display. Watercolor paintings, some clearly the king's own work, depicted landscapes and architectural details that revealed an artist's eye for beauty in unexpected places. A fire crackled in the grate, creating an atmosphere of intimacy that made the vast castle feel suddenly personal. "I wanted to speak with you away from the formal constraints of dinner," Charles said, gesturing for Trump to take one of two comfortable chairs arranged near the fireplace. State occasions have their place, but real understanding develops in quieter moments. Trump appreciated the directness. Throughout his business career, he had learned that the most important conversations often happened away from boardrooms and formal meetings, in settings where people could speak more freely about their actual thoughts and concerns. "Your Majesty, I have to admit, this evening has been different from what I expected," Trump said. "The formality is impressive, but the conversations have been more substantial than most diplomatic events I've attended." The king smiled, pouring brandy from a crystal decanter that had belonged to King George IV. "The ceremony serves a purpose. It demonstrates respect for the office and the institution. But the real work happens when we can speak as individuals rather than as symbols." Their conversation ranged over topics that would never appear in official diplomatic cables. Charles spoke about the loneliness of inherited leadership, the challenge of maintaining personal identity while fulfilling a role that belonged to history as much as to any individual. Trump shared his own experiences with the isolation of the presidency, the difficulty of distinguishing between genuine friendship and people who wanted something from his office. "The crown changes everything," Charles reflected. "People see the title before they see the person. I imagine the presidency creates similar challenges." "It does," Trump acknowledged. "But you've had a lifetime to prepare for it." I came to this from the business world, where relationships are more straightforward. People want to make deals, or they don't. Politics is more complicated. This led to a fascinating discussion about the different kinds of power they wielded. The king's influence was largely moral and cultural. He could convene conversations, inspire initiatives, and represent continuity, but he could not issue orders or implement policies. Trump's power was more direct, but more temporary. He could make decisions that affected millions of people, but only for as long as he held office. The monarchy's advantage, Charles observed, is that we think in terms of decades or centuries. The disadvantage is that we cannot respond quickly to immediate crises. The presidency is the opposite: enormous power to act quickly, but within a relatively short time frame. Trump found this perspective illuminating. His business background had taught him to think strategically, but the presidency demanded both long-term vision and immediate responsiveness. The king's approach suggested ways to balance these competing demands. Their discussion turned to more personal topics as the evening progressed. Charles spoke about his environmental activism, not as a political position, but as a deeply held belief about stewardship and responsibility to future generations. Trump, despite their different approaches, found himself moved by the king's obvious sincerity and the depth of his commitment to causes that went beyond immediate political advantage. "I've been criticized for speaking out on these issues," Charles said, "but I cannot separate my role from my convictions. If I don't use whatever influence I have for things I believe matter, what is the point of having that influence?" Trump understood this dilemma. Throughout his presidency, he had faced similar choices about when to use his platform for causes that mattered to him personally versus maintaining purely political calculations. The king's willingness to accept criticism in service of longer-term goals offered a model for principled leadership. The conversation revealed unexpected parallels in their experiences despite their vastly different backgrounds. Both had inherited institutions: Trump, the Republican Party, and the American presidency, Charles, the British monarchy, that came with established expectations and constraints. Both had sought to modernize these institutions while respecting their historical significance. The challenge, Charles reflected, is change without destruction. How do you adapt ancient institutions to modern realities without losing what makes them valuable in the first place? This question resonated deeply with Trump's own experience. His presidency had been built on promises of change, but he had learned that effective reform required understanding what was worth preserving as well as what needed transformation. As midnight approached, their conversation turned to the evening itself and what it might represent for future relations between their nations. Both leaders recognized that the personal connection they had established could provide a foundation for addressing more complex diplomatic challenges. "Tonight has been remarkable," Trump said. "Not just the ceremony, though that was impressive. The conversations have been more substantial than most international meetings I've attended. There's something about this setting that encourages people to think beyond immediate political calculations." Charles nodded. "Windsor has that effect. The weight of history puts contemporary problems in perspective. When you're surrounded by evidence of how previous generations solved their challenges, current difficulties seem more manageable." They discussed specific areas where their nations could collaborate more effectively: trade relationships that benefited both sides, security challenges that required coordinated responses, cultural exchanges that could deepen mutual understanding. But these policy discussions felt different because of the personal rapport they had established. The evening concluded with a private tour of the castle's artwork, including pieces that were rarely seen by the public. Charles's knowledge was encyclopedic. He could discuss the history of individual paintings, the techniques used by various artists, and the stories behind acquisitions that spanned centuries. For Trump, who appreciated fine things, but from a collector's perspective, this offered insights into a different way of thinking about beauty and cultural heritage. Standing before a painting of Queen Elizabeth I, both leaders reflected on the challenges of representing something larger than themselves. The Virgin Queen had used her image and her intelligence to preserve English independence during one of the most dangerous periods in European history. Her portrait seemed to challenge contemporary leaders to think as strategically and act as courageously as circumstances required. She never married, Charles observed, because she understood that the crown itself was more important than any personal relationship. That level of sacrifice is harder to imagine in our era, but the principle remains relevant. Sometimes leadership requires putting institutional needs ahead of personal preferences. Trump found this observation particularly poignant. His own relationship with political traditions had been complicated. He had built his career on challenging established norms, but the presidency had taught him to appreciate the wisdom embedded in many institutional practices. As the evening finally concluded and Trump prepared to return to his quarters, both leaders understood that something significant had occurred. What had begun as a formal diplomatic occasion had evolved into a genuine meeting of minds, a chance for two very different leaders to find common ground and mutual respect. The impact would extend far beyond the immediate diplomatic benefits. Trump would return to America with a deeper appreciation for the value of long-term thinking and institutional stewardship. Charles would remember an American leader who proved capable of engaging thoughtfully with different perspectives and finding respect for traditions that were foreign to his own background. In the months that followed, their personal relationship would facilitate conversations that might otherwise have been impossible. Trade disputes would be resolved more amicably, security cooperation would deepen, and cultural exchanges would flourish. The evening at Windsor Castle would be remembered as a turning point in Anglo-American relations, but more importantly, it demonstrated that personal connection and mutual respect could bridge even the most significant differences in background and approach. The ancient walls of Windsor Castle had witnessed another historic moment, one that would influence international relations for years to come. But perhaps the most significant achievement was simpler. Two leaders had met as human beings rather than merely as symbols, and had discovered that understanding was possible even across the greatest divides of culture, tradition, and political philosophy. As Trump departed the following morning, he carried with him not just memories of magnificent ceremony, but insights that would influence his approach to leadership for the remainder of his presidency. The evening had demonstrated that true diplomacy required more than negotiation. It demanded the courage to engage with different worldviews and the wisdom to find value in unfamiliar traditions. The impact would last far beyond the headlines and photo opportunities. A relationship had been established that would endure through future challenges, built on the foundation of mutual respect discovered during one extraordinary evening in one of history's most remarkable settings.